Welcome to Orensha Tech, and we're in part 5 of our PowerShell series where we're going to go over the pipeline. And the first question we're going to ask is, what is the pipeline? The pipeline is a way to connect commands together by taking the output from one command and using it as the input to another. Now, the character for the pipeline is the vertical bar, and some of you might be familiar with this based on how it's used in Linux, although PowerShell has a lot more capabilities than its Linux counterpart. So let's just run a command here and we'll see how this works. So we took a git process and piped it into the where object, which then filters based on the name equaling PWSH. So we take one command that gets a bunch of data and pipe it into another command, in this case, which is filtering it down. But of course, we could take that and pipe it into any command, and we'll go over some of the semantics there as we look at some more examples. So first, let's look at one of the best examples for the pipeline, and that's exporting to files. We can export to CSV, JSON, text, XML, and the pipeline just makes it really easy to do this. So if we run git process export CSV in our path here, then we can open up this file inside of Visual Studio Code. We can see here we've got a lot of data, a lot more than is outputted into the shell, which we can see right here. But we can see some of the data pieces like this right here aren't going to be the full data set. They're going to be the highest level of what that data piece is, which is the System Diagnostics Process Module Collection. So let's look at another example there for threads. If we run git process pwsh select object threads, we can see that it gives us this collection of thread ID numbers. So let's run this a different way so we can look at the data. We can see here that this actually pulls up all of the data inside that property for threads. And this is called a nested property, where it's going to have a PowerShell object structure inside of another PowerShell object structure. And this is giving us all of the data. So what if we wanted to export to CSV and include all of this data? Well, first we'd want to convert the PowerShell object to JSON and then export it as a file. So let's go ahead and do that. And then let's open up this file inside of Visual Studio Code. And we'll find our threads property. So we can see here that it's giving us all of the data now and not just that highest level data point that we got with the original export to CSV. And then if we want to pull this data back into PowerShell, we can run the git content with our file path. And that pulls the data into PowerShell again, although it's not going to be exactly the same as what we had before we exported it to the JSON. And that is where a tool called Export CLXML comes in. CLXML is PowerShell's solution to exporting any type of PowerShell object into an external format that can then be uploaded back into PowerShell and resemble very closely that original PowerShell object. And the two main commands there are the export CLXML and the import CLXML. And you might be asking yourself, if it resembles PowerShell objects so closely, why wouldn't we just use that all the time? Well, the format is much bigger and it is specific to PowerShell. And another piece about it is that it encrypts credentials that are on the computer and only decrypts them when it is the exact user on that computer that imports those credentials. So this is a great tool for most things, but there could be a case where you don't want that to be, and you we'll have to export it to a different format like JSON or CSV. So let's run an example of this. We'll take git process pwsh and export that to the CLXML with our path. And then we'll open up this inside of Visual Studio Code, and we'll take a look at this file. So we can see this is almost unreadable to the human eye without really diving in deep and seeing what each of these pieces are. So it's a great tool for exporting and importing with PowerShell. Not so great when you want to take the data and run with it somewhere else. But let's look at importing it back into PowerShell just so we can see a use case for that. So again, we've got all this data here, and in the end, it just gives us these 4 objects. So a great tool, something to keep in your back pocket, but again, it's not something that you're going to be using when you want to take that data somewhere else. So next, let's look at the command out file. Out file gives you a flat text file. So it doesn't really care what format it is in. It just takes the data and puts it right into a flat file for you to use however you want. And let's look at an example with get service. And we'll put a filter on it here for anything that begins with T. And we can see that here with our wildcard, the star, it's going to grab anything, whether it's 0 characters or many characters, as long as it starts with T, it's going to grab that service. And then we'll put it into an out file, services.txt. And a few of these are permission denied because of administrator control, but we'll look at most of them here in this file. So we can see all of these services that start with T. It's just a plain flat text file that resembles that output that we see in the shell when we run this command and it displays it for us, but it's a way to get it just into a generic text file. And another cool thing we can do with out file, if we wanted to add data, we can use the append switch. So say we want to add the date at the end of this, we can always do that with the append right here at the end of out file. It's also something great when we are building log files. We can just keep adding to the same file with the out file append switch. And then an alias for the out file is dir with the greater than symbol and our file name. So this is an alias for out file that allows us to not specify that command at all. We just simply use this greater than symbol, and it's gonna pipe that command right into the file that we want. Okay, let's look at comparing files next. And we're gonna start by looking at the help file for this. Compare object is the command that we use to compare 2 different PowerShell objects. And the main parameters here are going to be the reference object and the difference object, as well as this property parameter that's going to allow us to only compare certain properties within those PowerShell objects. So again, this is designed to take 2 sets of PowerShell objects and give you the differences between those 2 sets. And let's just look at an example of this with get services. So we're going to export our services with the get service and export to a CLXML file. And then we are going to stop our spooler service. And then we can compare object, and our reference is going to be the file that we just exported, and the difference is going to be a fresh set of that data using the get service command. And we're putting that in parentheses there to grab that. And then we're using the property parameter to call out exactly which properties in those PowerShell objects that we want to compare. For instance, if we were looking at processes, there's going to be a lot of data that's different. So you're usually just going to want to look at certain properties to see whether they are there or not between the two different sets of objects. In this case, we're going to look at name and status. So let's run this. And we can see here with these symbols, it's going to tell us whether the object is different between the two PowerShell objects. And then depending on which way this is pointing, it tells us which one that it found that object in versus the others. So we can see here with our spooler that it is stopped in our right file, in our difference file, but in our reference file, it is running. And then same with this clip CSV. So a really cool command to use if you want to easily query to find the differences between two sets of PowerShell objects. This is great, for instance, if you take a set of processes or services that are running on your standard computer that you know is working, and then you can take that and query it against all your computers to see if any of those computers are not running your standard set of services or processes. All right, next, let's look at out default and out host. These are two commands that are run without really ever being seen. They're tagged on to the end of our commands to give us data in the shell in a way that's easily readable. So when we run git process, really we're running git process piped into out default, which is our default formatting, and then that gets piped into out host. So whether you run this or the other one, it's the exact same thing. That's the default way that PowerShell is going to run your commands to output it in this nice looking format in the shell. And to learn more about out commands, we can run the git command out with our wildcard, and it's going to show us these commands here, and we can then look up the help files for those if we're interested in how any of the out commands work. All right, let's look at another common scenario where we are exporting to HTML, and that command is going to be ConvertTo-HTML. So let's run git service, pipe that into our converts to HTML, and then we'll give it our path here to create our file. And again, some of those are behind some permissions, so we weren't able to query them, but that's perfectly fine. Let's open up this file and take a look at what it looks like. So here we've got our HTML file, and of course, if we open this up in a browser that's meant to read this, it's going to look really pretty. So let's go ahead and do that now. So as you can see here, it's a great tool to be able to export your data into this HTML file that you could send to your boss or put inside of a report that's already formatted in a nice way. You don't have to do anything else. It's just already here for you to take and run with. All right, let's look at some of the key differences between the export and convert to. Now, the main difference here is that export is taking and doing the conversion and it's outputting to a file. So it's doing two things, while the convert to is just doing the first thing where it's converting from PS object to a specific format like JSON or CSV. And having just the convert to is useful for a lot of scenarios where we are taking the data and keeping it inside of the shell and piping it somewhere else, whether it's to an array or any other scenario where we want to keep that data inside the shell and not put it into a file. So both have their uses and both are great in specific scenarios. It's just a matter of figuring out which one so you can use the correct one for what you're trying to accomplish. And then let's also look at the difference between import and get content. So get content is not interpreting the data type. It's simply grabbing what is in there, the text that is in that file. And import is specific. You'll run import CSV or import CLXML, and it's actually going to do the get content and a conversion from that data type into the PowerShell object. So that's a great tool to get yourself the data right back into the shell to start using as that PowerShell object format. But again, that does lose a lot of the functionality that you have with the original PowerShell objects, some of the commands that you can run, but nonetheless, a great tool to have in your back pocket. And speaking of taking actions on those commands, let's look at some of the ways that we can do that. Now, this is not something you're ever going to want to run, but let's just look at this here. So we have get process piped into stop process. If we were to do this, it would start stopping all of the processes on our computer. Now, you might want to try this on a virtual machine one day, but not something you ever want to do on a production computer. But again, it is possible. That is a way to use the pipeline. And if you were to filter the get process command before piping it into stop process, it's an excellent way to accomplish what you need in a quick, simple one-line command. So we could use this command, which is a better way to use the pipeline. So here we're getting the MS Teams process and stopping it. An excellent way to use that without crashing your computer. Other combos of this are going to be get job, and then we can pipe that into stop job, or we can pipe it into receive job or wait job. These are excellent examples of ways to get a set of data and then take an action on it with a different command. Now, in our last lesson, we looked at two switches, what if and confirm. And these are great things to tag on to our commands here that are going to allow us to add a little bit of a buffer. So with what if, it's essentially going to tell you what would have happened if you ran this command. It's going to give you a verbose statement that says stopping this job or stopping this process, but it's not actually going to do that thing. And then confirm is going to ask you whether you actually want to take that action before it does the action. So again, another way to just add some buffer between what the command does and actually accomplishing that command without knowing fully what it's going to do. So definitely some great tools, the what if and the confirm switch. Definitely play with them. And that is it for this lesson. But watch out for part 6 of this PowerShell series, where we're going to go over more commands and adding them into our shell to use. And you can get a link to the full series right above here. So thank you for watching and have a good day.